did my dissertation work on technological risk in the late 1980s. And I was actually old at that time, it seems. But so I've been looking at this for a long time. The risks I was looking at, or the technologies I was looking at that time, were not these big, mega transformative technologies like biotech and nanotech and synbio and all these things that seem to be coming in these huge waves down the pike. I was looking at new but somewhat more ordinary, smaller technologies. And but it's interesting to see how some of the things that we're learning about risk reactions, risk responses, risk perceptions that I did way back then, I'm now coming back to, sort of like feel like I've come full circle. But having said that, and again, much of these remarks, even in the beginning, are not directly responding to Dr. Schoberg, but in some cases I've actually sort of rearranged some of my things to kind of respond in some ways. One of the things that I was reminded of, not only thinking back to my own work, but in listening to Dr. Schoberg, is that risks are not static. I didn't look at this systematically. I didn't bring numbers, decided not to do PowerPoint, but just talk. But the data I've seen recently in the US on nuclear power, for instance, have changed dramatically. People are much more positive than they were. And this has been going on for a couple of years. I don't actually think this is a response to concern over climate change. It may be a response to something going on in the media, although I'd have to be convinced of that as well. I think it has more to do with the price of oil than anything else, that people are concerned about their daily life and getting through their daily life and buying gas if it means buying gas. People have to get to work, even if we're trying to develop more efficient transportation, more mass transportation. We all know that's going to take a while. So people are concerned about getting through their daily life and how risk factors into that, but not necessarily limited to the probability of harm. And if there's a theme to this talk, by the way, since I didn't bring PowerPoint, I should tell you, since you may not have noticed on your agenda, the talk's title is Risk of What? Thinking outside the paradigmatic equation. People don't think narrowly about probability of harm, and this is something that some of Dr. Schoberg's data certainly brought out. People think broadly about advantages and disadvantages and ethics. Some of you know I'm the editor of Science Communication, which for those of us who are interested in science communication, we should take great pride in the fact that this is now the 9th ranked impact factor communication journal. That means it suggests a quite active research community of which we're a part. It's gone up considerably in the last year in terms of its impact ratings. The article we're publishing, we just published this month in Science Communication, showing that or arguing that, I think all risk research argues rather than demonstrates, because things have gotten so complicated, but arguing and presenting a great deal of empirical evidence suggesting that attitudes towards stem cells are not a function of knowledge, not a function of risk, but they're a function primarily of the belief in the moral status of the embryo. Now that makes common sense when you think about it, just like it makes common sense to say one's belief in scientific methodology and scientific results is going to be a predictor of how one reacts to technologies that are a result of those methods and results. But moral status of the embryo has nothing to do with probability of harm. It's, in a sense, an ethical risk. People are concerned that there are uncertainties about ethics, just like they're concerned that there are uncertainties about health or environment and so on. So this is one of a sort of a category of what I call social risks. And I'm not at all convinced that people make clear distinctions between risks and, say, ethical impacts or social impacts. I used to have a talk that I gave from time to time, gave a couple of times anyway, called Materials Don't Have Ethics, which was a quote from focus groups I did about 5 years ago on nanotechnology and stem cell research and kind of comparing people's reactions. If you ask people about nanotechnology, they don't see that nanotechnology has ethical components, but then when they talk about their concerns, some of them are things that we would classify as almost more ethical concerns than risk concerns. So that's why I titled this talk, Risk of What? Another kind of way of illustrating this that I've used actually for a number of years, I actually had this on overhead, so I think I have a PowerPoint version, but that's how old this particular way of talking about this issue of risks that are broader than what experts might conceptualize. I used to have an overhead that I used to have a matrix of nice, neat little round dots. And I would tell people, well, this is, all the things we might think of as risks. And then draw a nice, neat little square around it and say, around some of those dots, and say, well, this is what experts think of as risks, whether it's the probability of harm, whether we factor in severity. They're competing expert definitions, but it's really just a small subset of the things that people who are not experts might be responding to when you ask them about risk. Dr. Schoberg made a distinction between personal risk and general risk, between risk to self and risk to others. And I think those are steps in the right direction, but I think the real picture is way more complicated than that. I think some of the data that I've looked at, not published because I don't really know that I would have known what to say about it, but a number of surveys seem to show risk and ethics behave almost like overlapping or confounded variables. People don't necessarily factor out ethics when talking about risk. They don't necessarily think about either ethical issues or risk issues the way someone trained to analyze either one as an expert might think. Rather, it's a much more fuzzy shaped pattern of elements that people seem to be responding to when you ask them these generic questions about, well, is this risky? Is this risky for you? Is it risky for society? So ethics gets mixed up. Severity, certainly we factor in a way this is a survey design issue, but it also has more broadly to do with how people in fact respond to technologies that they think are risky. They don't necessarily make a nice, neat square box and say this is the elements that contribute to risk, and these other elements are ethical. These other elements have to do with economic impacts or advantages and disadvantages. The price of oil, for example, greatly seems to be, in my, this is speculative on my part, but at least hypothetically, if I'm correct that the price of oil is what's driving public opinion around nuclear power risks, this is another confounding. It's not that the risk has really changed, but what people respond to risk questions in a different way because the balance of economic pressures and concerns is different. So it's an extraordinarily complex area, and that's why we continue to do, those of us who are interested in it, continue to do new studies to try to tease this out. But I would like to encourage us to think more about the dependent variable in this equation. Risks of what? What kind of risks? When we ask people if something's risky, what on earth do they take this to mean? And do they really make this clear separation between probability of harm and severity of harm? I don't think so. I'm not even sure that they're thinking narrowly in terms of harm. I think many, many things influence how they would answer such a question.